Okay, so the second part of the lecture, we talked about the appeal of socialism, why it was very attractive for the broad masses of national populations, why so many people were willingly and independently striving, or why they were willing to accept the idea of socialism. But now we should also have a look at how socialism worked in practice. In other words, how do you achieve that bright future? How do you achieve that bright future the socialism is promising? If you had any idea, I would be very willing to hear it, but because this is an online lecture, I cannot ask the audience. Well, any socialist would probably tell you that what's absolutely essential and fundamental for achieving better future is to get rid of bourgeoisie. Okay. But what does it mean? What does it mean? Then what? Okay, so you remove bourgeoisie, and then what happens? And what happens? The workers will take over the factories, and again, then what? What happens? So this is not enough. These are some particular steps, partial steps, maybe, but what's absolutely essential for any socialist, and that's what happened after the end of the Second World War in all those countries that became socialist countries in the end, is the transformation of the existing socio-political order. Okay, in other words, from a liberal order that dominates the 19th and the first half of the 20th century until the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. Changing this socio-political order, liberal order, into a socialist. Now, how do you do that? Or what are the elements, what are the results of this transformation? In the economic dimension, you wouldn't have capitalism anymore. You would live in socialism. Okay? And on the philosophical level, which is very, very often neglected, but it's also very, very important to realize and to be aware of. On a more philosophical level, in the political dimension, the individual would not mean as much as it used to. The community itself would mean much more than the individual. Okay, that's why we speak about communism, because community is the supreme value. Okay. Now, what this means when we analyze it a bit further, well, it means this, that the primary concern wouldn't be making money anymore. It would be society, the well-being of society. Okay. Once again, the individual wouldn't be the supreme value anymore. It would be the entire community. Individual as a concrete person would blend in the entire community, which would be the supreme value. And very importantly, the priority wouldn't be private profit anymore, but it would be public profit. Okay, not profit for one particular individual. Okay, but the profit for the entire community. So if we start from the end this time, if we pursue public profit and not private profit anymore, then we care about the well-being of the entire community, not the individual. Okay, and therefore we don't live in the capitalist society, which is primarily concerned with accumulating capital. Okay, but we live in socialism. Okay, socialism, which is concerned more with the well-being of the entire society. So this would be the general level. This is the general level. But inevitably, another question is, how do you do this? How do you do this? So on the general level, you want to change the society. Okay, that's fine. But how do you do that? You want to change the socio-political order, but how do you do that? Once again, you get rid of the bourgeoisie, fine, bourgeoisie is not there anymore, workers govern the factories, fine. And then what? And then what? Okay? Well, socialists would tell you, and what's essential is the transferring of the ownership of the means production from private to public hands. Okay. Now, inevitable question is, what are the means of production? Essential term for political economy in general, but also for Marxism. Means of production are three, basically: land, labor, and capital. Land, labor, capital. Okay. Now, what does it mean to transfer the ownership of the means of production, land, labor, capital, from private to public hands? Well, on a general level, it means that there wouldn't be any private property, and we are using a Marxist term already. It will be public property. Okay. In other words, expropriation of private property and giving it to public hands. Another term for expropriation is nationalization. Nationalization. Okay, so not that the individual would run a bank, the entire nation, that's why it's nationalization, the entire community would run the bank, in more general terms, the entire economy. The entire nation would own the industry. Okay, that's why we have branches of industries that are entirely nationalized, typical transportation, because they are there in the interest of the entire community. Once again, in other words, the entire nation. Okay, land, a bit special case, because typically land is not expropriated and given to the nation itself. The process is exactly the opposite. In any socialist country, Poland, Romania, of course, the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution, but after the Second World War, in Central and Eastern Europe, in any agricultural country, Hungary as well, the redistribution of land to small landholders, from big landowners to small landholders, is the essential component of any socialist program. And it's heavily popular. It's heavily popular because you are giving land to those who don't have it. Okay. Once again, this is the crucial mechanism for turning a capitalist country into a socialist country. And why is that? Why is that? Once again, this provocative question. Well, once again, the rationale is to pursue the interest of the entire community, right? So the rationale of all of this is to pursue the interest of the entire nation. Okay, why is that? Well, because typically the factory owner pursues his own interests. He doesn't care about the nation. What he cares about is his own economic profit. Okay? While if we conduct this nationalization, the entire community would work in the interest of the entire community. So, in other words, the rationale is that the community does not exploit itself. Okay? A typical capitalist would exploit you. But if the means of production, land, labor, capital, are in the hands of the entire community, okay, the rationale is that the community would not exploit itself. In other words, it would run banks, for instance, in the interest of the entire community. So, the director of the factory in socialism would not fire you, for instance, because you are redundant and you are decreasing his own profit. He would not fire you because he's not interested in his own profit. What he's interested in is your well-being. Okay, that's the rationale behind it. And this is just the summary of what I just said. If the entire community owns the means of production, it pursues the interests of the entire community. Therefore, society is not divided into ruling and ruled, oppressing and oppressed, exploiting and exploited. They are all equal to each other and therefore free. And this is the fundamental goal of communism. No class distinctions anymore. Okay. Only human beings equal to each other, working in the interest of the entire community. If this is not clear enough, I would once again remind the quote of Friedrich Engels, who says exactly what I just told you. Okay. The streets are generally in a disgraceful state of filth and disrepair, and that the layout of the dwelling reflects the greed of the builder for profits. Okay, so there's someone, private businessman, private entrepreneur, who is interested in his own profit. So he invests only as much as to satisfy the very, very basic, elementary, fundamental needs of those workers, but not more, okay? Because if he invests more into comfort, luxury, he is losing his profit, and he doesn't want to. What he's interested in is as much money as possible, okay? So if you want to understand this quote, you need to analyze how socialism works in practice, what's the rationale of socialism, and how socialists and communists want to achieve that. Okay? And this is exactly what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe after the Second World War, because people agree that liberalism did exactly this, and exactly this ultimately led to the outbreak of the Second World War. So this is the appeal of socialism. Let's get rid of this, okay? No private businessmen, entrepreneurs anymore would effectively control our working and living conditions that are so miserable that they satisfy only very extremely elementary needs, very often not even that. In which ventilation is lacking. No windows, no sewage system, no fresh air pollution all around. And this is capitalism in its most brutal form. And it's the appeal of socialism as well. So once again, concrete achievements, concrete appeals of socialism, and the answer to the question once why socialism is so attractive is this. Okay, socialism, because it cares about the well-being of the entire community, does not pursue private profit, at least not primarily. It's more interested in subsidized transportation, for instance, subsidized housing. Is this profitable? Of course not. Of course not. MTR in Hong Kong is not profitable at all. Okay, it's very cheap. At the same time, it's very effective. It's punctual. It's safe. It's clean. Someone needs to operate it, and it all costs money. Okay, and it definitely doesn't earn as much to effectively compensate all the costs that it produces. Okay, so state has to interfere. The community, in other words, has to interfere. Housing, the same. Paid holidays, not profitable at all. It's the factory director who needs to pay for that. Okay, education, once again, state pays for it. Okay, state pays teachers, not a private entity. Let's say healthcare, public hospitals, the same. Universal unemployment, that's the goal. Okay. So, to summarize all of this and to explain why socialism was so popular in 1945, and that was its advantage, without any doubt. So it was in a much more favorable position than capitalism, liberalism, and Western style democracy, okay, in 1945, at least, is this. So what is the appeal of socialism? Once again, a better future. And a better future for society as a whole. Society as a whole, not for few individuals, but for as many, at least, as possible. 90%, 90%. That would be great. How can it be brought about? Well, by transforming the existing socio-political order. And if you want to change the existing socio-political order, you need to conduct a revolution. Okay, very, very rarely in the conditions of the 19th century, especially, but also the first half of the 20th century, and also after the end of the Second World War in Central and Eastern Europe, this could be done by evolutionary means. So not evolution, but revolution. Okay. How concretely? Well, during this revolutionary process, you conduct nationalization. Okay. In other words, what you are doing is that you're transferring ownership of the means of production from private hands to public hands. What's the rationale behind this? Well, the rationale is that the public profit instead of the private profit leads to common good. In other words, if the entire community, typically a nation, the state, would own the means of production, there would not be any exploitation because the community cannot exploit itself. And the public community would pursue public interests. In other words, the interests of all, not individual, singular interests like a banker, but the interests of all. Okay. And what is the optimal way to carry out this transformation? Well, this is where it becomes very interesting because there are different answers within the ideology of socialism, because Marxism is but one school of socialism. Okay, there are utopian socialists, there are social democrats, there are Christian socialists. Okay, so there are many ways how to change the society in the interest of common good, and they all provide different answers that we cannot discuss here. But the goal is the same. The objective, the end of history, okay, is the same. And the end of history is better future for society as a whole. So this all sounds great, I would say, at least. So how come? How come it didn't work out? Because without any doubt, the Soviet socialism failed at the end of the 1980s. Because there was a wave of revolutions when people rejected this form of socialism, Soviet-style socialism. And they were very happy, at least in Central Europe, to return to the capitalist way of life, we might say. Okay. So what happened? Well, partial answer can provide Jacob's bond again.
At about this period, 33, 34, the kulak class is being liquidated in millions of peasants are dying, starved, or being deported by Stalin. 33, 34, we're in the midst of the 5-year plan, or the second 5-year plan, I can't remember. But in any case, millions of people are dying in the Soviet experiment. If you had known that, would it have made a difference to you at that time, to your commitment to being a communist?
This is a sort of academic question to which an answer is simply not possible. I don't actually know that it has any bearing on the history that I've written. If I were to give you a retrospective answer, which is not the answer of a historian or something, I would have said probably not.
Why?
Because in a period in which, as you might say, mass murder and mass suffering are absolutely universal, the chance of a new world being born in great suffering would still have been worth backing. Now, the point is, looking back as a historian, I would say that it was probably not the sacrifices which were made by the Russian people were probably only marginally worthwhile. The sacrifices were enormous. They were excessive by almost any standard and unnecessarily great. But I'm looking back on it now and I'm saying that is because it turns out that the Soviet Union was not the beginning of the world revolution. Had it been, I'm not sure. After all, do people now say we shouldn't have had World War II because more people died in World War II than died in Stalin's terror?
So what that comes down to is saying that had the radiant tomorrow actually been created, the loss of 15, 20 million people might have been justified.
Yes. This is exactly what people said about World War I and World War II. Most people have ended up by saying, we think it was wrong in World War I. Very few people ended up by saying, we think it was wrong in World War II.
But isn't there some sense in which the radiant tomorrow can't, in principle, be built at that cost? Because it can't then be a radiant tomorrow. Because human beings have memories, and what they remember is desolation.
In the first place, I think, you see, a radiant tomorrow was rhetoric. It was the rhetoric of the people that I believed in, too. That's true. But it was pure rhetoric. We didn't believe in radiant tomorrows. We believed in a world rather than no world. We hoped that that would be a far better world. We hoped that it would be, quote unquote, a perfect world in which, you know, in some of us, when you're young enough, you believe that there wouldn't be any unhappiness. There wouldn't be any unhappiness in love in this new world. But that isn't true, even if rationally one knew that this wouldn't be the case. Nevertheless, the real secret of the whole business was, if you believe You are living in a world which is crashing about your ears. Your choice is a future or no future. And it was that. If you remember, and I quote it somewhere in my book, the famous phrase by Walter Benjamin about the angel. Huh?
The angel of history.
The angel of history, you see. That what the angel of history sees as he moves backwards into progress is precisely the ruins that are being accumulated by the process of history. So, in a curious way, even though we, as communists and other socialists, if you like, were committed to an upbeat view of the future, we really living through the period in which we knew we weren't living through a period in which all you have to do is to push the right kind of button and turn the right kind of switch, and everything's going to be.
So you're a very odd case. In fact, you're an English Jewish boy growing up in the Berlin in which Hitler comes to power.
Yes.
So that's where we are. Now, at 14, you do something extraordinary. You join the Communist Party. Now, why?
It isn't extraordinary. I can assure you that in 1931-32, it was not at all extraordinary for somebody to become a communist.
Why?
Because you can't understand anything about the first half of the 20th century, at least from 1914 until Second World War, right in the middle, without grasping that most people believed the old world was coming to an end. Inevitably. The old world was crashing. We were living in the crashing of an old world. And you had to look for an alternative. It was either fascist alternative, or it was a socialist alternative, which in Germany in 1931-32 would have meant communist.
1933. By 1936, you're in Cambridge,
Mm-hmm.
and right through your Cambridge years, and then in the post-war years, you're very actively in the Communist Party. What did it mean to be a party member in those years?
Those of us who stayed in and committed ourselves, I suppose the only thing to do is it's a lifetime commitment and a total commitment. It was the most important thing for us. Because, again, I've got to return to what we said earlier on. You didn't have the option, you see. Either there was going to be a future or there wasn't going to be a future. And this was the only thing that offered an acceptable future.
Now, when you say total commitment, I mean, how total?
If the party told you to do something, it would have priority over everything else.
I mean, if the party said you can't be going out with that woman.
Yeah.
Really? That far?
Mm.
It dictated your personal life as well as your political convictions completely.
In theory, at any rate. Whether it always did so in practice, we don't know. But in fact, to a surprising extent. I mean, yes, you know, I mean, it would have complete priority.
See, what I find very difficult to square here is your obvious restless independence of mind with this party belief. I can't see how someone like you could remain within a kind of organization of military Jesuits.
I think if you found you couldn't actually hold still for what you were supposed to, you just kept quiet. You dealt with something else. I mean, for instance, I never professionally wrote anything or said anything about the Soviet Union or the Russian Revolution, because it was perfectly clear to me that what you were officially supposed to say about it was just not so, or at any rate contained large chunks which were simply not defensible.
When did you know that to be the case?
So the question now is why socialism failed, and Eric Hobsbawm gave us some hints, also some answers. One of which actually might be that instead of liberation from oppression, okay, one of the fundamental appeals of socialism, socialism in its Soviet form, okay, did exactly the opposite. And as Eric Hobsbawm tells us in the video, this form of new oppression, new control, goes as far that it not only dictates your political convictions, it also dictates your personal life to that extent that it tells you which lady, man, which partner you are supposed to date. Okay, so we might generalize from this one concrete example that Soviet socialism failed because it fails to fully capitalize on its appeal, which once again was the promise of better future, and to deliver other its promises as well. Okay. If we analyze this a bit further, instead of offering a better future, we might say that there's no future at all. Instead of liberation, Soviet-style socialism offers a new form of subjugation, not to the bourgeoisie elite now, but to the party itself and its bureaucratic apparatus. Progress, security, justice, and equality. I already said that yes, partially that's there, but once the Western countries, capitalistic countries, once they learn from their mistakes, the mistakes of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, once they resort to something which is called welfare state, okay? In other words, creating a social net that helps you during the time of your hardships, economic and social hardships. Once they start offering subsidies, money, during the time when you are unemployed, once they start creating employment agencies that help you to find a new job, once they start offering requalification courses that help you find a new job because you learn how to profess or how to do a new job, okay, socialism in this particular regard loses its appeal very, very rapidly. Okay? And joy and optimism and galvanization. Really, is it really there? You cannot even date a lady you want to. Okay. It dictates the way you should think. Are you happy? Are you happy there? I don't think so. So instead of joy, enthusiasm, and positive vibe, at best, you resign and you don't want to participate in public life at all, and you become apathetic. And I want to explain this a bit further, a bit later, because this is exactly what happened in most countries of Central and Eastern Europe since early 1970s till the fall of communism there. And even if Soviet-style socialism did provide some achievements, offered some improvements, it was at the cost of this. Okay, once again, Eric Hobsbawm speaks unequivocally about this in the video. It's a very good video, by the way. It's freely accessible on YouTube. So if you have time, please watch it. Now about the resignation and apathetic part, this quote is from a very, very famous essay, Power of the Powerless, that was quoted by a Canadian Prime Minister very recently. The Power of the Powerless was written by Václav Havel, who is a dissident in communist Czechoslovakia and becomes the first president, non-communist president, after the fall of communism. And in his essay, Power of the Powerless, he analyzes what the system turns to be from its original, very, very appealing idea to the masses, what it became in the second half of the 20th century. And what it became can be described as this: because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything. It falsifies the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. It falsifies statistics. It pretends not to possess an omnipotent apparatus, an unprincipled police. It pretends to respect human rights. It pretends to persecute no one. It pretends to fear nothing. It pretends to pretend nothing. Okay, so instead of offering something concrete, something tangible, what it offers is but one big Potemkin village. And a Potemkin village is a metaphor here because these villages were built in Tsarist Russia to show the Tsar that everything is okay, that Russia is doing great, to placate the emperor. Okay, and once the emperor was gone, everything returned to the normal state. And this is exactly what was going on in the Soviet bloc, in Eastern Bloc, since, let's say, the 1970s, before the fall of communism. If we are to decode this a bit further, and if we are to understand why Havel uses these terms, we can have a look at this. He characterizes this post-totalitarian regime as such. The system touches people at every step, but it does so with its ideological gloves on. This is why life in the system is so thoroughly permeated with hypocrisy and lies. Government by bureaucracy is called popular government. The working class is enslaved in the name of the working class. The complete degradation of the individual is presented as its ultimate liberation. The use of power to manipulate is called the public control of power, and the arbitrary abuse of power is called observing the legal code. The repression of culture is called its development. The expansion of imperial influence is presented as support for the oppressed. The lack of free expression becomes the highest form of freedom. Partial elections become the highest form of democracy. Banning independent thought becomes the most scientific of world views. And military occupation becomes fraternal assistance, which is a clear reference to the occupation of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact troops in 1968. And there is another, this time very concrete example that Havel uses to further support his analysis. He uses his own experience when he was employed in one particular brewery in Czechoslovakia. And in that brewery, there was a brewmaster here in his essay, covered by the acronym ESH, whom Havel described as a skilled, proud craftsman who genuinely cared about his work and the quality of his beer. And because he sees so much wastefulness and inefficiency and incompetency around him, he writes an honest report to his superiors, who are the members of the party, in which he exposes all these malaises and bad practices in a particular brewery. And instead of being rewarded for his effort to provide some remedies, the party bureaucracy brands his report as a libel and dismisses him and publicly shames him. Why is that? Well, because you need to pretend in a socialist system that everything is okay. So instead of being appreciated for his attentiveness, let's say, and genuine effort to work better, he becomes a persona non grata, undesirable element, undesirable person, a dissident, who is excluded, demoted, and marked as a political suspect. Now, absolutely crucial here is to realize that You don't challenge the system. You do not challenge the system. You do not challenge the party. You do not challenge socialism per se. What you do is doing your job, actually. Okay. But because you do your job and the party, the system doesn't want you to do your job, because you must pretend that everything is okay, sooner or later you become political, because sooner or later you challenge the system, but not because you would want to dismantle the system. You just want to do your job properly. Okay. So in other words, you do not become a dissident because you would challenge the party. You become a dissident because you want to live in truth, okay, which is undesirable because the system, as Havel tells us, pretends that everything is okay. All right. So please be mindful of this very, very, very important element. And one of the fundamental reasons why communism failed in Europe, and why in this competition between liberalism and capitalism on the one side and socialism and communism on the other, socialism and communism lost because it became victim of its own lies. And there are some concrete manifestations of this, supported by numbers. You can see that the GDP per head in the United States was continuously, throughout the entire Cold War, much bigger. In other words, the American economy was much more efficient and productive than the Soviet economy and Soviet socialism. Why? Well, because even if you wanted to be efficient in a Soviet-style economy, the party told you not to be. If it doesn't make sense, we can discuss this in a class. Coupled very, very closely with this is the fear of innovations, because the party must control everything. Okay, so while in the United States, these stages of the Industrial Revolution that we call Industrial Revolution 3.0 and 4.0, in other words, introducing computers and then introducing robots and automated machines. Today, probably we might call it 5.0 as well, artificial intelligence. I think it's even, it's so different that it doesn't fall to the same category with robots. But anyway, while the United States were somewhere here, definitely, and here, definitely, the Soviet economy remained confined in the second stage. Okay? And that is why, this is the reason why Francis Fukuyama could write in his extremely famous essay, The End of History, the triumph of the West, the Western idea is evident, first of all, in the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism. In other words, it's not the socialist end of history influenced by Hegel. It's the capitalist way or end of history that seemed to be there in 1989. Now we know that Fukuyama was wrong. Okay, history didn't end. Liberalism once again is in crisis. But from the perspective of the end of Cold War, in this ideological competition between socialism and communism on one side and capitalism and liberalism on the other, liberalism clearly won. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Okay? Extremely famous work, extremely wrong as well. Why he was wrong? Well, because he made the same mistake as the Marxists themselves. Okay, but we can discuss this in a class. So, to wrap it up, socialism was appealing to the masses and millions because it offered prospect of better future. It offered this prospect against the reality of the 19th century capitalism, and it was so brutal and generated so much poverty and misery that those millions and masses willingly and independently turned to that ideology. Liberalism was deemed as an outdated ideology, definitely in the interwar period in the 1930s, and for many, also during the Second World War and after. In this competition between capitalism and liberalism, and communism and socialism, socialism and communism had clear advantages, because once again, liberalism was seen as an outdated ideology. But unfortunately for socialism and communism, these ideologies were not able to deliver its promises, and instead of full emancipation of the working class, at least, it became just another tool of oppression for the working class as well. In contrast to this, after the Second World War and during Cold War, the Western example was so powerful and so appealing and so successful in reality, and we can see it until today, that everyone else wanted to emulate it. Not even in Europe, not only in Europe, but also here in Asia. And I already mentioned Pax Americana and what the former Singaporean Prime Minister, Mr. Lee, articulated in the clearest terms. Okay? So, in this competition, from the perspective of Cold War, liberalism triumphed, and that's why Francis Fukuyama could become famous. All right, so that will be all for today. See you next week. Thank you so much.